Hello, everyone, and welcome to this webinar on taxation and philanthropy and the relationship between the two, if any, organised by Alliance and sponsored by 1000 Currents. My name is Andrew Milner. I'm a freelance writer and researcher, and I'm also the features editor of Alliance, and I'll be moderating today's discussion. As many of you will be aware, the special feature of our September edition is on this topic too. We're fortunate to have contributors from the issue among our panelists today, including one of the guest editors for the feature, Marlene Engelhorn, who we'll hear from shortly. But before we hear from our speakers and today's sponsor, just let me say a brief word about the format of the event. We're going to run for an hour. Each of the panelists will make a short presentation, and then we're going to open it up to a question and answer session, which we invite all of you to take part. There are a couple of ways you can get involved. Feel free to introduce yourself using the chat function, which you'll see on the speech bubble on the bottom right-hand side of your screen. You can also use this chat to let us know if you're having any problems with your audio. A team are on hand behind the scenes to help you if you need it, so do bear that in mind. You can also ask a question to our panelists at any time during the Q&A, during the session, using the Slido Q&A app you can see also on the right-hand side of your screen. We'll be monitoring that during the course of the webinar and selecting questions to put to the panelists during the Q&A. If and when you do ask a question, please tell us who you are and where you're from. Time is obviously limited, and now it's not very long, but we'll try to get through as many of them as we can. Also, should you wish to do so, on the bottom left-hand side of the screen this time, you'll see a CC button. This permits closed captioning in English and several other languages. Please do feel free to use that if it's going to be helpful. Finally, before I get into the event itself, if you want to take out a subscription to Alliance, this is the advertising bit, and read the issue on taxation and philanthropy as well as much else, you can use the code EVENT24, that's EVENT24, to get 20% off the subscription to Alliance. The link's in the chat if you want to take up that option, and I'll be reminding you towards the end of the webinar as well. Okay, so taxation and philanthropy, close relatives or complete strangers? If we see philanthropy as a voluntary form of wealth redistribution, what's the logic of part funding it with public money, which in effect is what tax incentives do? In any case, the evidence that tax incentives do significantly increase philanthropy is mixed. And again, if it does, the effects may well aggravate existing inequalities. In the developed countries, for instance, it's unlikely that tax incentives will have much effect on small out-of-pocket givers, and incentives are only significant for larger donors. So should we really be offering inducements which only the wealthy can take advantage of? If they are wealthy, should they not be both paying a full share of tax, and if they choose to do so, do philanthropy as well? Should countries that operate tax incentives introduce a graduated set of incentives or a cap? For all the money spent on it, philanthropy has done little to reduce inequality. In fact, many would see it as a vested form of inequality. Can we reasonably expect the wealthy to dilute their own influence by attacking the things on which that influence depends? Or should we leave the real work of social well-being to governments and to taxation? On the other hand, if taxation and philanthropy are both forms of redistribution, does their relationship need to be realigned? These are some of the questions we'll be looking at during the course of this webinar. These and many others which will emerge as we talk. We're looking forward to a lively debate. First of all, to kick off that debate in a way is Rajiv Khanna of 1000 Currents. 1000 Currents not only the sponsors of today's event, which means it's free for all of us, but Rajiv was also a contributor to the issue itself. We'll post a link in the chat to his piece. Native of Bombay, Rajiv is leading the new initiative at 1000 Currents called the Centre for Transforming Philanthropy, which will undertake research, knowledge production, donor education, and advocacy to shift the philanthropic sector towards solidarity and social justice practices. He describes himself as a recovering academic who's professionally trained as a historian of international relations with expertise in modern Europe, South Asia, and the Cold War. Rajiv, welcome. What's 1000 Currents' take on the issue we're discussing today?
Thank you, Andrew, and hello, everyone. It's really nice to be here. I'll just say a quick word about what we do. We're a public foundation based in the United States. We raise resources and regrant them to grassroots groups and social movements around the world, working on climate justice, food sovereignty, and economic justice. And then we also do the donor education, as you mentioned, Andrew. So what's our take on this issue? So I'll speak from a perspective of being based in US philanthropy. And from this perspective, in terms of taxation and philanthropy, they can enable each other in a positive way, but also have a negative impact on each other. In the negative way, we all know the United States has about $1.5 trillion that sits in foundation endowments and donor advised funds. And this is the amount that has already received the tax deduction for charitable giving, but it's just sitting there. It's not moving, it's guarded, it's being hoarded, it's just sitting there parked. And it's not moving because taxation allows that to happen, right? That's an intentional system of taxation that allows that money to be parked. And there's no penalty for not moving the money. So we say from about this endowment and the money sitting in donor advised funds that this money is twice stolen. Once from the extraction of land and labor from which all wealth is generated, and then second because it has received these massive tax deductions for charitable giving, but there is no charitable giving happening. And the US has lost billions and billions in tax revenue because of this, right? Gabriella can can talk about this. She's written about this. And this money could fund vital public services. The danger now is that you're reliant on preferences of an individual wealthy person versus what society needs. And that's fundamentally undemocratic because it's unaccountable and lacks transparency. In addition, in 2017, the United States passed these tax laws, and according to a new working paper that came out from the National Bureau of Economic Research, it says that the United States has lost $16 billion in charitable giving after those tax laws were passed in 2017. And that loss of $16 billion is permanent. It did not return in subsequent years. And that is the everyday donor, the small dollar donor that has, that has kind of receded from the scene. And again, this is a concentration of power and wealth and an undemocratic trend in philanthropy that has been enabled by tax codes. On the other side, the positive side, there's some talk amongst US legislatures of taxing foundation endowments and putting some spend down limits on donor advised funds. And that could have an impact on charitable giving as well, because it could probably reduce philanthropic giving if that proposal moves forward, as institutions and individuals could say, well, we've paid our taxes, so we don't have to give any charitable giving. Um, Taxes, of course, like philanthropy, are a mechanism for redistribution, but can we return wealth in a responsible and dignified way to the entities from which it was extracted through the mechanism of tax? That's a question that maybe you all can think about. Along with taxes, we also need deep and inclusive and accountable democracy to ensure resources are flowing in the right places. Two quick final points I'll raise is I want to globalize this conversation on tax as well in a couple of ways. We know that the countries in the global north, especially Europe, made their wealth out of colonialism and extraction from the global south, the former colonies. And even after colonialism ended, this extractive financial relationship continued in the 1960s and 70s and 80s through international development, structural adjustment policies, and snaring countries in the global south in debt traps. So you have this historical obligation to return money that was extracted, and how do you do that on a global scale when taxes are national? And finally, in terms of the global piece, I'll add a piece about climate and the possibility of this global redistribution through the mechanism of a global climate tax. Historically, of course, the global north has consumed most of the world's resources. It's largely responsible for climate change, but the worst impacts are being felt by communities in the global south that did not create this problem. So what would it mean to institute a global climate tax on wealthy countries to support nations in the global south and communities in the global south, not only to adapt to the new climate reality, but also take steps to mitigate climate change? So how can philanthropy create the enabling conditions for this to happen so that there can be a mutually reinforcing relationship between philanthropy and taxes at a global scale? So I'll pause there and pass it over to you, Andrew.
Raju, thanks very much. Just taking up that question you raised about the historical obligation to return money that's been kind of twice stolen, as you well, once stolen in this case. How do you do that through taxation when it's national? Do you see a role for philanthropy in that? Do you see philanthropists having a sort of redistributive role, or is it purely a sort of selfish or mitigated evil?
I think there can be a reinforcing relationship. I think philanthropy can create enabling conditions for that to happen, right? Just like philanthropy has created enabling conditions for other big shifts to happen. So I think it's very possible for this to happen on a global scale, and I think philanthropy can take the lead.
Right. Thank you very much. Marlene. Let me go on to Marlene Engelhorn, who lives and works in Vienna. She's co-founder of the initiative Tax Me Now, which since 2021 has brought together wealth holders in Germany, Austria and Switzerland to advocate for tax justice. She's the initiator of the Guter Rat für Rückverteilung, Good Council for Redistribution, where 50 people were chosen out of a random sample of 10,000 in order to debate inequality and redistribute 25 million of Marlene's inheritance based on what they thought were good ideas to tackle inequality and its many effects on society. Marlene, over to you. Could you just tell us a little bit about the Guter Rat initiative first?
Sure. Thanks for having me. I'm excited and a little nervous. Basically, I knew that when I got the inheritance, not only was it unjust, but also that I now had to do something, or else all the ideals that I hold regarding social justice and what have you, democracy, transparency, will just be nice, empty words, like with a lot of people who don't act as they speak. And so I needed to figure something out. And I've realized very quickly that I didn't need to figure anything out, but that I already had everything laid in front of me. Taxation was there and I wanted that, and I couldn't get it because my government wouldn't listen to me. I'm the only rich person in Austria who doesn't influence the government into tax regulation in their favor, I guess. I don't know, I do something wrong. And so I figured, again, I have to figure something out. And again, I realized I don't, but that there's a lot of people who already know a lot of answers, and I just need to let them do the work that they already do and trust them with that. And so instead of reinforcing patterns of power and just being the brilliant rich kid with the wonderful idea of how to change and save the world, I just realized that I'm never going to be that, and that's not possible. And I asked people to create this council to model democracy as closely as possible, also to show that a parliament-like structure, a democratically organized space, can be a space where even the most normal people, for which this random sample of 10,000 addresses was for, the most normal people, representative, when you bring them together and you facilitate this process, and I say you, but I mean teams of people, all of them very, what's the word in English? Like in this work, they're very engaged in this work. Like if they facilitate all of that, you can get incredible results, and you can just prove that there is no need for the brilliant rich kid. It is absolutely unnecessary. And it can be a philanthropic endeavor to redistribute your wealth, but it must be different from classical philanthropy, where there's a rich person in charge who says, this is good enough and worthy of my money. This needs to be broken apart. And if tax doesn't do that, and there is a strong incentive, I think, for governments to use tax to do that, there's always going to be some sort of a private sector, and this needs to be organized in a way that reflects the most critical and crucial ideals that we hold in democratic society. So democracy, transparency, but also participation of people who are going to be influenced and affected by all of the decisions made. They should be the ones making the decisions, because they can bring so much wisdom to the table in order to shape these decisions. And inclusion, because most of these processes are incredibly exclusive. And so I paid a lot of money for a lot of wonderful people to do incredible work so that they could redistribute even more money. And it was one of the best decisions I've ever taken in my life.
Great, thank you. It sounds that almost you're turning the sort of traditional foundation model on its head, where you're this sort of like professionalized sort of technocratic institution which claims to have all the answers, or selects the answers from among the sort of competing sort of grantees. That's interesting. Can you tell me what results you've seen from that so far? Have there been any sort of concrete initiatives come out of the Guter Rat?
So I want to say that I don't want to place the civic assembly model that the Guter Rat uses as the one alternative to classical philanthropy. There's a lot of ways to do things. I also wanted to embed it in my role in working for tax justice, doing a lot of public speaking work on the issue, and like create something that would really basically drop like a bomb in this whole sphere and be like, we don't need to do this the way we do them now. Let's think out of this box, because there's so much wisdom, there's so much creativity around. Let's just put it to use. And what I got inspired by as well was, for instance, Thousand Currents. I'm an alumnus of their wealth holder. What was the academy? Exactly, the academy. I did the academy, so I learned a lot from the program there. I learned a lot from the Guerilla Foundation, a foundation that also understands its role in funding grassroots movements, funding social change, understanding the ecosystem, and trying to do it in a transparent and democratic way where the people who are affected are part of this discussion and part of the decision making, shifting power, decision making power away from money, away from funders. I'm in the funder circle, to an activist council, because those are the people who are in the field. They know what's needed. They know who's working on it. They can actually say much better with much more precision what works well. So it's just one of many ways to open up an alternative and to turn things on their heads. I'm not saying anyone is better than another. I think there is a multitude of things to be worked out, but all of them, the ones that I think that are really doing extraordinary work, what they have in common is that they try to level out hierarchy. They try to make sure that democracy is part of their structure, their governance model. They try to be as transparent as possible. They don't lie. In Germany, you say you lie into your own pocket when they claim that, oh, it's well, we don't do political stuff. This is really out of the goodwill of our heart. Bullshit. Everything you do is political. Everything you do has an impact. It starts with your endowment. Where is the money lying? Where do you create your revenue? You were funding oil and gas and then you use it to sprinkle it on climate change activism. Jesus, right? Like all of these things, as open as we can talk about them, no, that's the wrong grammar, sorry. If we can talk about this more openly, what we enable is to actually check for what works, what doesn't work, and to kick out all the rubbish from the last centuries and let philanthropy arrive in the 21st century and in the democracies of the 21st century where it should belong. And that means also in the hand of the people that are affected.
Great, thank you. Can I just ask you before I move on, where do you stand on the question of sort of tax incentives for philanthropy? Do you not care one way or the other? We should all be paying more tax, especially wealthy people. Whether philanthropists pay tax on their donations is neither here nor there. What's your
Wealthy
view?
people have to finally start paying tax again. I don't know how it's in every single country of everybody who is listening in and joining. I'm speaking in Austria and in Germany in particular. And it's ridiculous if you look at how it works. There's been a study that has been conducted in Germany, Austria, and Switzerland recently by organizations in all three countries. There were Momentum Institute, Netzwerk Steuergerechtigkeit for the German listeners, right? ETH Zurich and Oxfam Germany. And they were finding that the middle class family pays the highest amount of tax. Then comes the normal millionaire, and then comes your quote unquote normal billionaire. Unless you're in Switzerland, then the billionaire pays a little more than the millionaire, but not more than your middle class family. And we need to look at tax systems and make sure that whoever has the most pays the most. Period. This is what everybody claims. This is what nobody really does. It's disgusting to see how wealth is always excluded and pampered and be like, oh, a wealth tax of 1%, and you make a revenue of 6% minimum per year. You will only be richer by 5% every year. I don't know if we can do this. You should come to our talk show and talk about your feelings about this. We never have a talk show with someone who pays income tax. It's like, how do you feel about your income tax? This is not a discussion we're having. So what we have is power problems, and power protects power. And wealth has lobby, and lobby has influence on politics. And I'm not saying there's an evil tax agenda, but what I'm saying is that there is a perpetual mobile of a status quo that is not questioning itself because it doesn't have to. And we need to. And if I can add to that as a wealthy person going into those talk shows and saying, I want to pay wealth tax. Where's my wealth tax? Why am I not getting my wealth tax? I'm an impatient rich kid. I want to pay my tax. What the hell? And if that helps bringing it to minds of people, then that's wonderful. I think we need, as Rajiv already said, we need to see how these two things, philanthropy and tax, can work together. And I really liked in our talk that we had, Rajiv, when you said to move against philanthropy, with philanthropy, beyond philanthropy. I hope I quote you correctly there. But to understand that this is complex, it's not an either or binary, all this binary thinking, another piece of rubbish for the 20th century. Let's open this up a bit more and see what is the actual potential of philanthropy, but also what is the potential of tax. And it's huge. And we must start by getting rid of all these ridiculous tax cuts for rich people and illegalize all these avoiding structures, because so much tax avoidance is legal. And we don't have to make it legal. It can be illegal. And then, like, we've seen what happens after 2013 with the transparency laws. I don't exactly know the name of the act for private bank accounts and information flow. It reduced offshore private money laundering and hiding of like private people. But I think 2/3, if I'm not completely mistaken. And I read the numbers recently, but obviously I'm not good enough to quote them properly. So please check it if you're interested, right? So we see that regulation can actually do a lot. And I believe in regulation more than in the goodwill of philanthropy. Even the best philanthropy is not as good as well-regulated society, democratic society, self-led, sort of like affected people being in charge society.
Great, thanks for that. Well, Chennai, you've got the good fortune to go next. Chennai Mukumba is the Executive Director of the Tax Justice Network Africa, or TJNA for short. She's based in Nairobi, Kenya, and provides strategic leadership and direction to deliver on TJNA's mission and vision in its various thematic areas. TJNA is a research and advocacy organisation with a network of civil society organisations with the united goal of leading tax justice voices across the continent. Through its Nairobi Secretariat, TJNA collaborates closely with its member civil society organisations to curb illicit financial flows, promote progressive taxation systems. In partnership with other regional economic governance institutions, TJNA advocates for tax policies with pro-poor outcomes and tax systems that curb public resource leakages and enhance domestic resource mobilisation. TJNA's vision is to see a new Africa where tax justice prevails and ensures equitable, inclusive and sustainable development. Chennai, could you talk a little bit about what does tax justice mean in Africa, and is it possible to speak of it in a sort of Pan-African context where the countries are very different?
Yeah, thanks for that, Andrew. And again, a huge thank you for the invitation to speak today. So, I mean, to echo what's been said, tax justice is this idea that those who earn the most or have the most in terms of wealth are paying the most in terms of taxes, or are contributing more to government purses, right? So this is this idea of progressive taxation, which Marlene and Rajiv have just made reference to, and this is work that as an institution we are constantly thinking about, right? Constantly working to see how we can support African governments to do this, right? And the reason this is important, right, is on two fronts. I think the first is that we are convinced, right, that if we are able to get this progressive taxation right in many African countries, we would be able to meet our own developmental objectives, right? And so the dependency on either development assistance or, for example, even private financing, right, is something that we could almost start to wean ourselves away from, because the numbers show this, right? As a continent, a lot of multinational corporations and wealthy individuals are funneling close to $100 billion outside of the continent, right? And this is more than the amount that we receive in both development assistance and private financing, right? So there's something to be said about if we are able to get our tax systems right. There's a certain autonomy, independence that African countries could have, right? And support to support them to meet a lot of our own developmental objectives, which looks like the addressing of poverty and inequality and all of these crises that we have on the continent. So I think on my side, maybe just to speak a little bit, right, to the conversation, what we've seen on the African continent is at best, right, philanthropy actually has contributed at times to a number of advancements, right, with regards to attaining some of our a number of sort of health objectives, education objectives as well. And part of this is because, you know, philanthropy has a certain flexibility, right, that allows it to sort of quickly fill gaps where the government resources may, for example, fall short or be insufficient to address. Having said this, right, it also has a number of notable limitations, right? Given that it's premised on this concentration of resources that are within the hands of a few, it really reinforces these power imbalances, right, that were made references to earlier. And it creates this dynamic where it allows individuals with the society, right, this few, to determine where resources are being directed based on their individual preferences rather than on the needs of society, right? And so can also then result in a lack of accountability and a lack of transparency, right? With decisions being based on individual or sort of donor agendas. And I think this dependency, particularly on philanthropy, that we have started to see on the continent, can create at times problematic situations, right? Particularly when for example, a philanthropy organization perhaps decides to change an area of focus, right? Or decides to change the direction of their resources, right? And we've actually seen this happen, lately, right? This sort of change of focus. And that then have impacts, right? Particularly if it was being funneled in an area that perhaps the government might have thought, okay, well, this is being addressed by philanthropy, right? So it creates this situation whereby the addressing of a systemic issue is completely undermined, right? And you potentially create more of a problem, right? Where you were trying to address a specific situation. Now, as I mentioned earlier, we do a lot of work on tax, right? And the reason for this is because governments that are able to depend much more on the income that's being generated domestically, right, are able to have a much more predictable stream of revenue, right? Unlike, for example, what happens with philanthropy, and therefore able to direct it to wherever it is that they feel that those resources need to be. There's research that actually shows that governments that are much more dependent on taxes and resources that are being generated domestically are much more attuned to the needs and the desires of that society, right? So taxes allow for a much more responsive government in this respect, right? And so I think on our side, whenever we're thinking about this philanthropy tax solution, tax is is always the solution that we think needs to be the one channel to addressing many of these developmental objectives. Having said that, particularly in developing countries, we do find, though, that there are challenges, right, in generating tax, particularly in lower income countries, due to a whole host of different reasons, such as, for example, insufficient tax administration capacity. But part of this reason, actually, the part of the reason we see challenges with regards to the ability of governments to raise taxes is often at times due to the resistance of wealthy individuals and corporations to pay their tax, right? And so you can almost see this situation where governments are trying to raise the resources to cater for the needs that they have, right? But they're unable to do so because we have multinational corporations of wealthy individuals not paying their tax, and then these are the same individuals or companies that then want to then put resources where they think it's most important, right? And so we have this situation, right, that tends to be quite convoluted in that respect. I think for us at the end of the day, in an egalitarian society, right, the scenario where super wealthy people exist and can decide where to channel resources really shouldn't exist. I think at the end of the day, we hold very strongly on this notion of the capable state, right, and the need to strengthen the state to be able to be that responsive, right? And so I think, as I conclude, for me, when I was sort of thinking about this presentation, I think the question that we need to explore, right, when thinking about philanthropy is how can philanthropy support strategies, right, that in the long term minimize its current role in society, right? I think for me, when thinking about healthy philanthropy and philanthropy that really is working in the best interests of individual societies, this is the question that I think many philanthropy organizations need to be exploring in order to allow for societies that are much more democratic, inclusive, and responsive to the needs of their people. I'm not sure if Andrew's muted. Is it just on my side?
Andrew's on
Andrew,
mute,
you're muted.
How embarrassing. So thank you very much. I'm sure everyone in the panel will agree with that, Chennai. Just specific on the question of the role philanthropy can play in securing tax justice, is there one? I mean, what should philanthropy be doing to beat the drum for a fairer tax regime across the globe, fair tax regimes across the globe?
I think for me, right, particularly if you're thinking about that last question that I asked, right, it's philanthropy that is being invested in building the capacity of the state, right? I think we want philanthropy to be invested in, for example, right, strengthening tax administrations, right, strengthening institutions, right? I think for me, that's where you will see philanthropy playing a role that ultimately starts to chip away, right, at the function that it's currently playing, that I think it shouldn't be playing, right? I think for me, that for me would be philanthropy being directed in a way that is most beneficial for our society.
Right. I mean, it seems we're coming up against this question again and again that I think, as Marlena put it, power protects power and wealth protects wealth. And that's a sort of, that's kind of the nut we've got to crack. So just let that sit with you for the time being. We can maybe think about that later on. I want to bring in Gabriela Sandoval. Gabriela Sandoval spent her life fighting for economic justice. As the only English dominant speaker in a working class immigrant family household, her outsized role in the economics made her acutely aware of economic inequality as a child. She currently works as executive director of the EWDI, the Excessive Wealth Disorder Institute, where she leads work to address the corrosive influence of excessive wealth on US government and society more generally. Previously, Dr. Sandoval served as director of race and equity policy for TURN, the Utility Reform Network. She began her professional career as a faculty member of the sociology department at the University of California in Santa Cruz. Gabriela, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I also identify as a recovering academic. So this has been such a fantastic panel. I'm completely inspired and also daunted to follow such a fantastic group of speakers. What can I say that hasn't already been said? First of all, I agree with so much of what you all have shared. And so let me start by telling you a couple of stories. When I was working on the Alliance article for this month's issue, I co-authored it with Vinny Bansali, who serves as the executive director of Solidarity Network. And I was processing at the time some difficult information about increasing global temperatures and the impending crop failures that we're likely to see as soon as next year. And I fell down a rabbit hole that week. I allowed myself to become consumed with this potential impact, the potential impact that will have on my daughter's life, not so much my own life, but my daughter, who is 16 years old. And, the knowledge that at the rate our climate is deteriorating, there may not be a healthy planet, a healthy enough planet to sustain life by the time she turns 50. And it was under this dark cloud that I co-authored and edited the article. In one round of edits, Vinny, my co-author, changed the concluding paragraph of my draft to ensure that our article was published with a more hopeful conclusion. And she encouraged me to think and contribute and write about where we've made headway. But in the end, my concluding and hopeful paragraphs were that, well, they weren't mine. She ended up having to basically edit the end of our article because I couldn't muster up the optimism or the hopeism, as someone recently said. So in preparation for today, I thought about what I might share with you by way of hope. And so here's a little bit of what I came up with. When I began formally working on the closing the racial wealth gap initiative over a decade ago, we talked a lot. And when I say a lot, I mean, really, we spent about 99.9% of our time talking about building assets and communities of color in the US. But a wealth gap connotes two sides of a chasm. And it seemed that no matter how often I tried to bring up that other side of the gap, I was told that it was a non-starter. And in fact, many of my colleagues in philanthropy said, it's a third rail, don't touch that, don't risk your funding for the good work that you're doing by talking about excessive wealth. And so since then, I've seen, how we've moved toward this concept of good philanthropy. We've grown voluntary efforts to give more, right? Voluntarily. So efforts like the Crisis Charitable Commitment. We have the important voices of individuals such as Alan Davis, who founded my organization, the Excessive Wealth Disorder Institute. And probably more importantly, we have policy-focused efforts such as the Donor Revolt in the US, which has put forward a 10-point policy platform that would address charitable giving reform in a systemic way. We have organizations of wealthy people like Patriotic Millionaires and Marlene's organizational efforts of people who are asking to be taxed at higher rates. That's a critical intervention. And then we have organizations dedicated to donor organizing, such as Solidaire Network. We're also beginning to see interventions in the wealth defense industry. I recently ran across the Wealth Hackers Initiative, which, we really do have to, and maybe this is the one piece that hasn't been brought up so far, but we really do have to address the middle people, the intermediary industry propping up this problematic and unjust system. We must make meaningful connections between taxation and philanthropy. Those connections are a critical part of the work because we have to recognize that what we need is not charity, but good government, as so many of my co-panelists have said. And finally, and this is where I think I find the most inspiration, is I believe we're finally beginning to recognize that we need to connect all of these efforts. In the US, we're working really hard to connect the state efforts to the federal efforts. And I love the fact that we're having this conversation about global efforts and ways that we can change the system in order to all pull together. And so, the fact that 10 years ago, I was definitely not encouraged to talk about that other side of the racial wealth gap in my work. I think this is an idea whose time has come, and we need to be poised to take advantage of every opportunity to make a difference.
Gabriella, thanks. Just to ask you this from your perspective, there's the whole question about sort of foundations and their tax exempt status to start with. Is that justifiable? Do you think we should be just saying, all right, let's wipe away all tax exemptions for foundations? That would obviously be, pragmatically speaking, that's going to be very difficult in somewhere like the US, I would think, where you've got enormous sort of lobbies of power potentially in terms of the big foundations. Should we just allow that to ride? And what do we say about new foundations? Should we let them have the same tax exemptions, or should we change that and just say, oh, the ones that fell on the right side are lucky, but the other ones are now got to pay?
Well, we definitely need to find a way to phase this out. I mean, this goes back to a point that all of my co-panelists have made, which is that we would not need to incentivize charity if our governments and our democracy functioned properly. If we closed all of the legal and illegal loopholes that exist for folks to hoard their wealth. And in fact, we have to really recognize that philanthropy is likely working as it was set up to work. As an effort to primarily hoard wealth, not to actually make the positive interventions that, Chennai focused on, right? I think it's of course it's commendable when philanthropy does good, but again, if we weren't, to Marlene's earlier point about if your money is invested in fossil fuels and this is how you're getting an 18% return, and then you're sprinkling money on climate justice efforts, the whole system is broken and rigged. And so you're absolutely right. We're fighting an uphill battle, but there has to be movement toward actually making the system one that works for everyone and not just the wealthy few.
Right. Thank you, Gabriella. Let me move to the Q&A. We've got a few questions here, which I'd like to put to you. There's one from Lynn. Is there a tax system that comes close to the way speakers envision it? If so, what role does philanthropy play there? Anyone who wants to have a go at this one? Don't all shout at once. Rajiv, can I come to you? Can I be brutal and come to you for this one? For your first go at this?
I don't know of a tax system that comes close to redistributing resources in the way that we all envision, but I don't know the tax systems of 200 countries around the world. So, maybe there is, right? But I think we'll have to look really hard to find it. And in terms of what role philanthropy plays, I think I can just give a couple of examples, Lynn, about uh, I think we have to go back to thinking about what is the role of philanthropy in bringing about these big shifts, right? What is actually that philanthropy can do? And if philanthropy was designed as a mechanism in the United States, especially to hoard money, but not to move it towards causes that actually shift conditions that would make philanthropy unnecessary, right? Then philanthropy has no incentive to do something like this. However, there are ways, right? Philanthropy can also create enabling conditions. So, for instance, we are giving resources to groups all over the world that are holding big development institutions accountable, that are working towards debt cancellation of countries in the global south. So we are doing that. On the climate front, we are supporting different networks of grassroots organizations, networks of civil society groups all over the world that have been instrumental, for instance, in putting the loss and damage agenda in the COP negotiations. That is one way in which we can redistribute resources to the global south in the framework of this climate tax, right, that I've been talking about. No one's going to like climate tax, right? But I think loss and damage, whatever we call it, the idea is how do we redistribute? So I think there are ways in which philanthropy can support organizations like what Chennai is doing in Africa, right, around tax justice, so that civil society groups, people-led groups are strengthened to hold their governments accountable. And I think that's a role philanthropy can play in strengthening civil society.
Right. Just on that, I mean, that's quite difficult, isn't it? Because philanthropy itself is unaccountable. And that's often one of the big criticisms made of it, that it's actually this sort of, it's at the whim of the donor or the institution. So, how do you get them to actually sort of beat the drum on behalf of more accountability, which is, it's in some ways like turkeys are voting for Christmas, isn't it? It's one of those sort of, so, okay. Let, unless anybody's got anything else to say on that one, can I just move on to another question here?
I have
Sorry, Chennai.
Yeah, sure, Andrew. I just wanted to speak to that question quickly, and I think I've seen Jenny's question, and I think I might know who Jenny is. So I think I think with regards to whether there is a tax system like the one we're describing, I don't know that any country has it wholly correct, right? But I do think that there are some countries that are doing a better job, right? That I think there are certain lessons that we can learn from. And so, I mean, without speaking to specifics, right? There are some countries, Nordic countries, for example, right, that are have significantly high tax rates, right? But I think there, what almost makes it accessible, right? And this is sort of speaking, reiterating what I've heard, right, from people from revenue authorities in that countries, right? Is the fact that once these revenues have been raised, they're then directed, right, to areas where the average person can see that their taxes being spent. I remember, I think it was last year, I traveled to, I think it was Finland, and I had a taxi driver who was there from an African country, and he was telling me that, he was being taxed much more where he was than when he had been back home. But he said, I'm happy to pay those taxes, right? And this is to Jenny's point. I'm happy to pay those taxes because I can see the results of that, right? I think you can see the social contract, right, at play, right? And I think this is what makes tax systems a little bit more acceptable, right, particularly on the citizens, because absolutely, I know very few people who actually enjoy paying taxes, except of course on this group, right? But I think for many citizens, this is what they want to see. They want to see their taxes being used to their benefit. But for a number of low-income countries, like I said, we don't yet have capable states. And I see the value of philanthropy, good philanthropy, being in the investing, right, of the strengthening of taxes to be able to provide those services for themselves so that we can start to wean out the dependency. But I think that journey and that conversation is one that I think could be useful to have.
Okay, great. Thank you, Chennai. And Jen, just to kind of fully state Jenny's question, this people, as Chennai says, people just kind of was programmed into modern individuals that don't like paying taxes, even if the proposal's progressive. It's often easier to work on specific tax proposals like ending VAT on hygiene products rather than the broader tax system like capital gains tax. Any thoughts around the panel on this? Gabriela, can I come to you on this?
Absolutely, Andrew. So I would echo some of what Chennai just shared. I think that when we see we have to be able to see our tax dollars at work. We have to be able to see the benefits. The other thing is that, the tax system is unnecessarily complicated in at least in the US. I guess I can't speak for all tax systems, but it really is, and again, purposely so. There's such a huge gray area that exists, and this is partly what allows folks to take advantage, especially folks with lots of means, to hire attorneys and CPAs and lobbyists. It's part of the reason that folks are able to take advantage of that system. And so we really have to make, and this is part of our work at the Excessive Wealth Disorder Institute, is really make visible the invisible structures that exist. I recently had a conversation with a group of friends of mine from graduate school. These are some of the smartest women I know. And I said something about the marginal tax rate versus the effective tax rate. And one of them said to me that she and her family pay an effective tax rate of 70%. And I said, no, you are not understanding how taxes work. And so this is part of the problem, is that most people don't, at least in our country, most people don't understand. One, they don't understand how their taxes work. Two, they don't see the benefit of paying their taxes. And we've suffered from really 50 years of scorched earth policies around taxes and the kind of, third rail that they represent for elected officials. We don't have a lot of elected officials who want to talk about taxes. And we need to reverse that. We need to till the ground. We need to make it fertile, to plant new seeds, to really make clear the benefits of a system that works. Folks often say to me, well, you want us to pay more taxes, but our government doesn't work. Well, our government doesn't work precisely because it's been taken hostage by the excessively wealthy. And so again, to that link between a functioning democracy and a functional government and the role that it plays in ensuring that the tax system is not rigged to the benefit of a very few people. And I'll stop there because I could go on and on, but
it's
I'll
interesting.
stop
Somebody like me has got a small taxpayer, is too stupid to fix the system anyway. You have to be rich to be able to take advantage of this sort of what we call tax avoidance, which is legal rather than tax evasion. So it's the poorer people that can't benefit from the loopholes. Sorry, anybody else got anything to say from Gabriella's points? Okay, let me move on to, here's a question from Michael Jarvis. How do we get philanthropy motivated by when they've got other priorities like climate, health, or education to care about and support those pushing for tax reform? It's low down the list of priorities very often. So yeah, how do we get that up the agenda?
I can give that a shot.
Go for it, Chennai.
Yeah. Hi, Michael. I think my response to that would be all of the issues that you've just flagged right now are interconnected, right? And I think to meaningfully address whether it's a climate or education issue, as opposed to sort of put a band-aid, right, on a broken issue, you need a systemic approach, right? And so I think one of the issues that I know we've said before is that, to give an example, we on the African continent have a debt crisis, right? But even if you were to cancel all the debt today, right, in a few years, you'll find that many African countries are finding themselves where they were, right? And the reason is because we need a systemic approach to addressing this issue, right? You can't just address one. The whole system needs to be looked at in order to meaningfully look at that particular issue. So I think if we were to try and convince philanthropists is to say, if you genuinely want to address the climate change issue or the education issue, you need to take a much more structural and systemic approach. And one of the key ways to do that, right, is by this issue of investing in taxation systems so that governments who have the ability to look at all of these issues, right, from their perspective, right, are able to then, see how they're able to allocate resources to sufficiently do so. Otherwise, pouring money into this one issue, I think for me will provide a temporary solution one that could potentially be undermined by something else, right, that will have a direct impact on that.
Okay. Anyone, anything to add? Marlena.
Yeah. What came to mind after listening, and I fully go with what Chennai said, is that there's a fetish for efficiency, to pick the one keystone that will like then make sure that everything else falls into place, and it's not going to happen because of the interconnectedness, but also like this efficiency fetish that we have. We see this a lot in effective altruism, for instance, a kind of philanthropy that thinks that if it really does a maximin approach to whatever problem they want to solve, it will be solved, and boom, you get your best output for your money, which it goes with what Gabriela says about wanting to see your dollars, your euros, your whatever your currency is at work. And I think it sounds counterintuitive, but what you can't measure might be much more impactful. For instance, if you help fund social movements, for instance, a social movement that brings people to the streets to say, hey, we want climate justice, we're here, we're loud, we're making sure to put pressure on our governments, that might trickle down into much more effective solutions that are on top, if there is a really broad engaged society behind it, right? Be much more sustainable, because it will reflect the people that will be affected and their wishes and their needs. And to create this kind of communication between the system and the people that are affected, and to put funds into that, it's really difficult to measure that. Is it more impactful if you have like people blocking a territory for mining, or is it more impactful to have a lobbying effort in tax avoidance, whatever, a strategy of letter bombardment, you call that in Germany, where you create a letter and you give it to all your constituents and they all send it to their local political representatives, who then feel that there is a lot of pressure, which then translates into party pressure. Like, you can't really measure that. It's really difficult to put that into numbers, but those are the complex parts of change and where change happens, and it needs something else. It will not be done with a quantitative approach, but you will need trust, you will need relationship building, you will need community building, you will need mobilizing of a lot of people who are also able to eventually drop out because enough others come to fill that gap and then come back again, because there's burnout rates and all of this. You will need organizing. So really logistical factors are at play. That might be the most quantitative aspect of all of this. And there is this idea of trying to find the perfect solution, because you want to basically buy the end result, but you can't. What you actually have to what you have to buy, if you want to buy anything. And philanthropists are, like me, only the clients of the change that they want to see at best, right? We're not necessarily the ones who are driving it. We can be when you scout for the specific groups that are like super, super cool or whatever, and you might be able to balance out 1,000 currencies immediately coming up in my head. When you realize, okay, there's, for instance, a huge gap in racial funding. Like, what's the racial funding gap? Is that the word? Racial funding gap, right? And then to choose organizations that are always overlooked and help them, and specifically target these and choose them. Like, you can have these balancing efforts, but at the end of the day, you remain a client of the work, and the people who are doing the work are not necessarily the philanthropists themselves, right? So to have an approach that is less on this quantitative side of things, that's not to say that's not important, but to really go into those trust, relationship, community building efforts, and understand a different kind of role, an enabler role, rather than I buy the solution, the result, but I want to try to help facilitate the process, also in order to have the process facilitate itself and become a self-organized, self-led process. But that's tricky. And if you want ideas on how to do this, I've already said that I'm biased pro 1,000 Currents Foundation, but also the Guerilla Foundation, very, very biased there, because they have taken this approach. Mama Cash, wonderful organization doing extraordinary work on this, but also Chorus Foundation. Just a few people coming to mind, organizations that come to mind to really try to put this. Obviously, I'm forgetting a lot, but if anybody's interested, check them out, because they can and reach out. They can help you figure out how to shift away from this quantitative solution stuff fetish. I'm muting myself. I'm sorry.
Andrew, if I could just add one thing to this
Sure,
wonderful intervention that Marlena has just made, which is that philanthropy also has a really important role to play in providing cover for organizations that are actually poking the eye of philanthropy itself, right? So there's a large swath of NGOs and nonprofit organizations around the world who may be faced with punishment in terms of losing funding for their critical positions toward philanthropy. And so philanthropy has a very important, progressive philanthropy has a very important role to play in terms of providing cover for those organizations so that we might move those efforts more effectively and efficiently.
Right. Reggie, can I bring you in on this point because you're the head of the Centre for Transforming Philanthropy. Is that kind of transformation that Gabriella is talking about something that you're working on? Is that your kind of
Absolutely, absolutely, Andrew. And I wanted to put in a plug here for donor education and organizing, right? That many of my colleagues have mentioned. And that's how you get donors and wealthy people to see things in a structural way, right? Systemic and interconnected way, as Chennai mentioned. That's how you get donors to support civil society. That's how you get donors to think about their giving in qualitative ways, as Marlena was saying, right? And Marina mentioned a few organizations. I'll add a few more to that list, right? Resource Generation in the United States that has offshoot globally has done an incredible job of organizing and educating young people of wealth and class privilege to think about how they can support tax justice. Gabriella mentioned Patriotic Millionaires and the Solidaire Network, 100% putting in a plug for those as well. There's a Half My DAF kind of field building initiative here in the US, right? That move half your money. There's all these also spend down foundations that, let's spend down our endowments in 5, 10, 15 years. Let's give away our DAFs in 5, 10, 15 years, right? The so-called class traders, right? As Resource Generation calls them. And it's not just about education and organizing, but it's also part of that organizing is to get them to influence their peers, right? Because we know wealthy people listen to other wealthy people and have access, relationships, and networks that we are not privy to, right? So I think it's about kind of organizing, creating those ambassadors, influencing, and then let's see if we can reach a tipping point, right? And then the momentum maybe can sustain itself. So I want to put in a plug for that too. And the ecosystem for donor education and organizing has also grown and evolved quite significantly in the US in the last 5 or 7 years. So donors now have a lot more options in a way that they didn't, say, about 10 years ago.
Right. I'm sorry to say this, but we're nearly out of time. So can I just go around and get a kind of last thought from any of you? Last words, any takeaways from this? Any final thoughts? Chennai, can I start with you? Anything that stands out from today's proceedings that you want to sort of reiterate or you want to focus in on?
Yeah, I mean, I think first of all, really, really exciting and enriching conversation. I think a lot of what's been said was really sort of reiterating, right? A lot of what we had in our sort of magazine articles. I think for me, maybe just drawing back to Michael's question, because that's what's forefront of my mind. I think we really need to focus on systemic and structural change. I think we need to move away from this cherry picking of preferred issues, right, that an individual wants to fund, right, and rather think about where can we put resources to ensure that we are, the point I made earlier, building capable states, right, but then also contributed to meaningful change. I think at the end of the day, success for me will be achieved when we no longer need philanthropy, right? When we're no longer dependent on it, and when governments are able to respond to the needs of their citizens and make decisions that are based on that level of accountability. Those would be my final words.
Right. Marlena, to you.
Tough one to follow. I also wanted to say philanthropy can only be taken seriously when it works on abolishing itself. So that's that, definitely. I wanted to add another organization because we had this point briefly, Gabriella touched on it, with the whole wealth defense industry. And there is a group, an organization, they're called Good Ancestor Movement. They're a wonderful organization, and I think the most similar one US-based that I know, but please correct me if anybody knows this better, is Core Data Capital or Cho Data Capital. I'm not sure what's the correct pronunciation. But that's really, I'm now talking about the GAM because I'm more familiar with their work. It's about asking the question, how much is enough? How much is enough? And that for wealth holders is a very important question. So many people don't get the luxury of this question because they want to reach an enough. But for wealth holders to have this question to be something that is meaningfully and also structurally addressed in order to redistribute excess wealth, to have a service provided to them for that, and to take them by the hand, because wealth holders might be intimidated by the power that they hold. I know a lot of them that are, and even though I am critical of it, I also want to make sure that we don't ignore that this happens, and then we find a way of bringing them to the table, and as Rajiv said, maybe build some power in that position of from a position of more, I don't know, what is the word, humility, maybe eventually, perhaps, to then address the redistribution at hand. So those are the things. But at the end of the day, what I really feel again today is we're getting more people. We're more and more and more and more people. We're a growing movement. Resource generation has also sister or movements in Europe now. So we can do this. I just don't want to wait until I'm 50 to see the results. I'm an impatient rich kid. So there you go. But thank you, everybody, for all the work that you do, because it has changed me. And so that's why I'm here now. So I already owe a lot to people who are sitting here right now. They don't even know it.
Thanks, Marlene. Gabriella, to you, the book's landed on your desk. Very, very quickly, a last word.
Well, I just want to express a ton of gratitude for this group of, my co-presenters, but also to the audience, because again, this is an issue whose time has come. We all have a role to play, and so onward.
Right. Rajiv, we're really out of time, so it's going to be a quick one.
We are seeing levels of wealth inequality that in the US that we haven't seen since feudal times, 500 years ago. Wealth inequality in India is as bad as it was when the British were ruling India 100 years ago. We have reached a tipping point, and philanthropy has a choice. Either it invests in wealth redistribution, bringing about wealth equality through philanthropy and taxation and deep democracy, or it risks making itself absolutely irrelevant. That is the fork in the road, and the choice that we make will determine, what our futures look like.
Great, thanks a lot. Thanks to everyone, and thanks to all of you attending today. I hope you've enjoyed today's discussion. I certainly have. If you did find it helpful and engaging, don't forget to use the link in the chat to take advantage of the 20% discount on the subscription to Alliance using the code EVENT24, which means you'll always have free access to events apart from anything else. Again, just let me end by saying thanks to our expert panelists, to all of 1,000 Currents for sponsoring today's events, to the Alliance team, in particular Amy McGoldrick, who sort of presses the buttons and pulls the switches and has produced today's event, and most of all for you to taking part. Thanks to all of you, and that's all from me. Goodbye.